In the Chronicles of History, King Charles admits to being the cause of Harry's departure. The ailing ruler who has been organizing his properties delivered 3 closed missives holding volatile realities regarding institutional structures that severed his son's connection. Uncertain of the duration he has left to survive with cancer ravaging his physique, Charles has assigned Anne an unachievable task to bring together the 2 siblings who have not conversed for ages. However, one wonders if decades of pain, confusion and separation can truly be mended. Furthermore, one asks what reality lurked within that ultimate closed packet. Come along as Princess Anne unveils the monarch's dying hope for his male heirs. Regarding Charles's end-of-life admission, watching a specific scene unfold within Windsor, sources claim this narrative could rattle the royal institution to its foundation. It commences with an intimate conversation where a 76-year-old King Charles looks straight at Princess Anne and confesses something he has never voiced before. In this version, he informs her that he himself, not Meghan, not the media and not William, is the actual cause for Harry walking away. According to the report, his hands shake as he unseals an envelope he has concealed for years. Contained within are missives intended for his sons, and alongside them lies a confession. He remembers instructing an 18-year-old Harry, still hurting from Diana's passing, that his duty was to back William and never outshine him. He currently is convinced that this directive persuaded Harry that he was of lesser importance. This interaction occurred merely months following Diana's burial during a hunting excursion at Balmoral. Based on the story, Charles believed he was readying Harry for a life of royalty. Conversely, he now thinks he solidified a deep emotional injury. The written documents go deeper as Charles clarifies inside him that choices Harry previously attributed to William were actually orchestrated by the palace under Charles's command. These included personnel placements that rendered Harry lonely, media tactics that shielded the successor, and funding disparities that brewed bitterness. Within this interpretation of incidents, the monarch acknowledges he constructed a framework that shoved the siblings into competition without either knowing who engineered it. Paperwork detailed in the account highlights instances like media briefings from 2005 depicting Harry as irresponsible while stressing William's dependability. It also notes protection adjustments in 2011 that lessened Harry's security, and fiscal logs displaying Harry getting notably less backing than his sibling for comparable tasks. Princess Anne in this narrative transforms into the guardian of all 3 secured missives. She remains in Charles's office as he presents an impossible deadline of 6 months to convey the reality and try for peace. He dreads passing away while his sons are separated more than any shortcoming regarding his reign. These notes are not merely acts of contrition, as they expose decades of covert choices neither son was aware of. Furthermore, Anne is selected for a single cause, which is that she is the solitary individual both men rely upon. William views her as consistent and just, while Harry recalls her as the aunt who pushed him without criticism. Prior to her departure, Charles hands her a 3rd packet closed with wax and intended for her exclusively to be unsealed only following his demise. It clarifies the reason she was selected for this ultimate assignment. Anne exits Windsor with the case secured, time running out and the weight of a family secret. This occurs within a story that might either mend 2 siblings or widen the chasm permanently. One asks how Anne even found out Charles was nearing the end. One wonders what transpired prior to her accepting this unachievable task. Regarding the 10:47 p.m. ring and the formidable packets, the whole tale starts at Gatcombe Park, where a solitary late-night ring interrupts Princess Anne's rigid schedule. It is 10:47 p.m., a time when her telephone usually does not sound. On the opposite line is Dr. Harrison, talking with careful exactness. The king desires to meet her first thing in the morning by himself. For Anne, that specific element conveys everything. Public statements regarding Charles's sickness had depicted it as treatable, but when a physician phones at night on his orders, the circumstance is seldom standard. She poses the solitary query that is significant, asking how dire it is. The quiet before the response is more telling than the terminology that ensues. Anne has historically held a distinct position in the household, near enough to grasp the stresses of the throne but removed enough to escape being consumed by them. As the second offspring, she existed alongside the hopes placed on her brother without bearing them herself. Decades of duty order and frank realism molded her into the household's silent rock. Motoring to Windsor at daybreak, she cannot avoid reflecting on the previous occasion Charles called her desperately. That was the day their mother passed away. Anne had been the solitary royal at Balmoral when Queen Elizabeth died. The Queen's concluding remarks to her had concerned William and Harry, 2 grandsons she felt were adrift in separate manners. She requested Anne to assist them in discovering their path back to one another. At that moment, Anne possessed no notion that Charles himself would subsequently put that duty directly in her grasp. Now let us retreat to the instant that reformed the whole royal household, the death of Queen Elizabeth II. The Queen passed away on September 8, 2022 at Balmoral Castle in Scotland, her summer home and the identical spot she had selected for personal family events throughout her existence. It was a spot she adored and where she frequently felt most relaxed. Officially, the reason for passing noted on her document was advanced age. There were no abrupt incidents, no theatrical last moments, just a steady weakening that had become more apparent in her concluding months. In the days prior to her passing, the palace released brief low-key announcements regarding movement difficulties and the necessity to modify her diary. There was no direct wording regarding a catastrophe, but associates and spectators remarked on her progressively frail look. Her concluding public function occurred merely 2 days before she died, when she greeted the new Prime Minister Liz Truss. Even then, she persisted in fulfilling the obligation personally despite obvious indications of weakness. By the dawn of September 8, physicians voiced worry and put her under clinical observation. The palace's phrasing that they were worried for Her Majesty's health was a beacon that the circumstance had altered drastically. Individuals of the royal clan started racing to Balmoral. Charles and Camilla were already located in Scotland. Others rushed towards the north. Anne, however, was previously there, as subsequently verified in formal announcements. Princess Anne stayed at her mother's side throughout the Queen's concluding hours. She later disclosed she had utilized the final 24 hours with her mother. That instance put Anne in a distinctive stance. She became the final close family relative to view the Queen alive and the initial one to observe the start of a new reign. At 6:30 p.m. that evening, Buckingham Palace declared the information the globe had been preparing for. Queen Elizabeth II, the most prolonged reigning sovereign in British records, had died tranquilly at Balmoral. The days that ensued were defined by a national overflow of sorrow processions, vigils and honours traversing decades of work. But for the clan, particularly Anne, the instance was much more personal. She subsequently stated she felt privileged and thankful to have been with her mother at the conclusion, recognizing both the private bereavement and the historical shift happening around her. For Anne, the Queen's death was not merely the finish of a reign, it was the start of a duty she had silently borne ever since. She was helping steer the following generation through a family still molded by sorrow, obligation and the burden of heritage. Anne possessed her commands, but would the lads even consent to peruse their father's missive, or would years of fury make them decline the dying king's last plea? Strain has subsequently increased inside Kensington Palace. The second William places the sealed note on his table. His tone turns icy as he asks, "If you imply both of us, then this chat is over." He moves away, walking toward the pane, maintaining his dignity by pure willpower. For 4 years, the public split between the siblings has been enacted across interviews, films and news banners. In this story, William reviews every volatile instance: the broadcast chat where Harry claimed a relative doubted his child's complexion, the digital series that featured intimate family recordings, the book detailing a dispute that rose into physical fighting. He informed the Globe, "I assaulted him and now father desires me to feign none of it occurred." William conversed with immense rage, but one could not overlook the pain. Anne does not debate, she merely informs him she wishes for him to peruse the note. What he performs afterward is his option. That packet follows William through hours of appointments, smiling for lenses, grasping hands and fulfilling tasks with the grace anticipated of a future monarch. However, back in Kensington Palace that evening, he eventually ruptures the seal. Inside, Charles's script is immediately identifiable. The communication is direct, stating, "I am going to tell you something I ought to have told you ages ago." What ensues is an admission that reinterprets everything. Charles details within this tale a sequence of choices William never knew existed. Staff alterations, security modifications, media plans and monetary distributions were all listed. Each option was executed to steady the establishment, but the accidental result was expanding the chasm between his sons. The story uncovers how specific depictions of Harry as the volatile one were molded by palace tactics intended to emphasize William's reliability. Funding gaps that left Harry feeling reliant was sanctioned year following year. Protection plans designed to safeguard the heir's young household had wave effects neither sibling grasped at the moment. One section brings William to a complete halt. Charles writes regarding Christmas 2018, when William privately asked why Harry's protection was being decreased. In this interpretation of incidents, Charles confesses he had told William it was Harry's preference when it was not. That was a falsehood, the missive states. Charles clarifies that the reduction was his choice and he permitted William to assume Harry was behaving carelessly. Later, when Harry mentioned safety worries as part of his choice to withdraw from royal tasks, William rejected them, ignorant of the reality behind the curtains. When Catherine comes into the space, the sheets are scattered across the table and William is stiff with shock. He is controlling you, he states, even while passing away he is controlling both of us. But Catherine, stable and forthright, provides another perspective, suggesting maybe he is finally being truthful about his role in everything that collapsed. Maybe knowing why events transpired alters what pardon even signifies. Her own background with severe media reporting has molded how she views the strains of the establishment. She understands how stories can be built and how standings can move with a solitary banner. I am not suggesting to disregard everything she informs him. I am stating this might demonstrate that the battle was never solely between you and Harry. Perhaps you were both battling the structure surrounding you. Quiet extends before William eventually sighs. The missive has not mended anything, not as of yet, but it has altered the terrain. That evening he phones Anne, informing her he consented to the gathering but he possessed stipulations. William has consented to meet but thousands of miles distant in California. Would Harry even accept Anne's ring, or had the destruction gone too deep to ever mend? Harry's telephone illuminated at midnight with a strange UK digit. Intuition told him to disregard it, as California had instructed him on the worth of limits. But something in his instinct urged him to answer. On the connection was Princess Anne. Her voice was firm, nearly medical, as she informed him of what nobody ever anticipates hearing. In this tale, Charles had been granted approximately 6 months. Then arrived the second impact. She bore a letter for him, one designed to clarify choices he had never been informed about. The ring left Harry gazing into the gloom, replaying the final time he had conversed with his father. It had been a brief, stiff interchange regarding coronation plans. No affection, no clue of sickness. A 7-minute chat that suddenly seemed like a lost farewell. Harry's initial response was guarding. He told her he did not require justifications, he had experienced it. But her answer carried the burden of someone who had observed far more than she had ever voiced, stating, "You do not know everything." A messenger showed up the following morning. The closed packet sat in Harry's grasp for almost an hour before he eventually tore it open. The terms struck instantly. Meghan discovered him in his study sheets scattered across the table, tears on his visage as he murmured that his father had known the whole time. All those instances he faulted William, his father knew and let it remain. The missive in this story revealed itself with bare truth. Charles confessed to options that had swayed both sons distinctively. Policies that preferred the heir, expectations that confined the spare, and instances where he had retreated rather than intercede. One section hit Harry the hardest, a confession regarding a time in 2019 when Harry had requested assistance during a meltdown, ignorant that fiscal and safety choices had already been executed behind the curtains. In the note, Charles admitted that these selections molded Harry's feeling of exposure, creating cracks he had not wholly grasped at the moment. For 3 days Harry remained with the note. He read it again, matched recollections, and discussed every phrase with Meghan and his counselor. The query Meghan presented hovered in the atmosphere, asking if he returned and it went poorly, will it reopen injuries that had eventually shut? Harry struggled with that, wondering aloud if peace was identical to healing. He questioned if it was merely evading the locations that still caused pain. In a late-night meeting he faced another dread, the chance that in voicing his tale publicly he had painted William into a trap he had not wholly deserved. What if his reality was unfinished? What if his sibling was just as confined as I was? Before daybreak Harry placed the call. Anne picked up instantly. His communication was distinct, stating he would attend but only privately, with no lenses, no arranging and no spills. A few hours afterward Meghan found him gazing at pictures of their kids. His tone was hushed but sure, stating if he did not go he risked instructing his children that ego outranked relationship. Meghan gripped his hand and informed him he had discovered his response already, he just required to hear himself voice it. Both siblings have consented to meet, but when they eventually confront each other at Balmoral, would Charles's admission bring peace, or would it spark the most volatile clash in royal records? The situation inside Balmoral Lodge transpired like a scene constructing toward a breaking limit. In this evolving story, tensions were already running elevated when Harry walked into the space. William stood by the pane, shoulders tight, while Princess Anne ordered both brothers to be seated. The vibe felt loaded, the sort of instant where decades of unvoiced history suddenly squeezed into the now. William commenced first, his voice piercing. He asked whether a final note from their father revealed earlier in this plot somehow absolved Harry of his own prior choices. Harry rebutted quietly, maintaining that both of them had been responding for years to a system that kept them in the dark. Their interchange bore the burden of two men who had spent half their existences misinterpreting each other. Then Anne shifted the power of the space when she brought out a file of papers collected within the story's timeline. In this invented series, the documents comprised palace logs, staff memos, and internal messages tracing back decades. Her argument was plain: Harry's view of uneven handling was not visualized, it had been ingrained in the framework around them. Fiscal breakdown, safety plans, and media tactics were all laid out in black and white. The exposure did not wipe away Harry's errors, and Anne made that distinct, but it recontextualized them. It demonstrated that both siblings had been swayed by powers greater than their own options. As William read the papers, Catherine intervened, carefully recognizing the hurt caused by public chats and the book Harry had issued earlier in the story's curve. Harry shocked the space by taking ownership and confessing remorse for instances where he had let pain steer his deeds. The talk turned again when William moved away from the desk, fighting to keep dignity. When he eventually spoke, it was with a fragility seldom displayed. He admitted that the strain of inheritance had molded him from youth, leaving him scarce space to voice anything beyond steadiness. He confessed something he had never voiced before, stating in many ways he had coveted Harry's capacity to step outside the establishment that defined both of their existences. Harry meanwhile admitted that from his vantage point, William had always appeared preferred, more safe and more honored. But as the strain started to melt, both men recognized they had been decoding the same setting through contrary lenses. Neither had grasped how confined the other felt. The space relaxed into a stillness that felt less like evasion and more like contemplation. For the initial time in years within this invented story, both siblings were viewing each other without the screens of public hope and family rules. By evening they consented to write a shared announcement, imperfect, wary but sincere. It was not peace, not as of yet, but it was the initial motion toward it. In the conclusion, the day at Balmoral Lodge did not fix everything, but it signified a shift. It demonstrated that even in the most rigidly managed settings, understanding can emerge when truth finally enters the space. They had finally heard each other, but could they actually stand together before the globe? What would Charles require of his sons in his final public instant? At precisely 6 p.m. the nation halted as a historic transmission commenced. Charles showed up at the identical desk his mother once utilized during the outbreak, but the difference was clear. Where Elizabeth had broadcasted steady peace, Charles bore a visible burden. In this evolving story, he spoke to the country with a blend of exactness and fragility, describing the gravity of his illness and the short timeline physicians had granted him. The instant changed drastically when he signaled for William and Harry to join him on the screen. For the initial time in years within this story's timeline, the siblings stood flank to flank, a sight that instantly grabbed the nation's focus. The transmission grew from a somber health report into a symbolic pivot point for a clan long defined by separation. As the announcement proceeded, the voice was calculated and joined. William focused on viewpoint, how sickness reshapes ranks and reminds households of what truly counts. Harry highlighted the stresses that had added to prior cracks and the shared choice to proceed differently. Their terms were knitted together on responsibility feeling and the conviction that peace is a journey rather than a show. The shared message recognized past errors without lingering on them. It depicted fragility as a type of power and offered the instant not as a final solution but as a deliberate change in path. The siblings made distinct that their father's state had become a spark for lucidity, pushing them to re-evaluate old stories and make space for something more wholesome. Responses flooded in immediately. Online arguments sparked, with some watchers doubtful of the scheduling and others touched by the harmony on display. Yet across networks, the ruling reaction was a wary feeling of optimism for a family often viewed through the glass of battle. The transmission felt like a scarce matching of intent. What the lenses did not record became just as meaningful after the transmission concluded. Charles asked for time alone with his sons, away from the public gaze. He mused on the years behind them with a blend of glory and sorrow. He recognized the results of choices made long before either sibling had command over their own existences and pressed them not to let his errors mold their tomorrows. Standing by the pane overlooking the lawns where he once strolled with them as kids, he offered a silent validation of their development. He viewed them as men who had constructed households of their own and in many ways had become variations of what he once wished to be. It was a private instant weighted with honesty, marking the emotional heart of a day loaded with public meaning. In the wider curve of this story, the transmission became more than a health declaration. It signified the start of a new section, one molded by truth, shared duty, and the chance of long-awaited mending. Charles had brought him together, but would it endure? From the very start, William and Harry's connection was molded by an odd blend of royal obligation and very real childhood nearness. They were not merely siblings maturing in the same residence, they were two lads navigating a life almost nobody else could grasp. In their early years, their mother made a calculated attempt to keep them rooted. They went on school trips in a normal vehicle, waited in queue at amusement parks, and spent weekends speeding around Kensington Palace on bikes. William, the elder brother, frequently watched out for Harry at public functions, gently steering him through masses and rituals. And behind the curtains, Harry was recognized as the spirited one who could make William chuckle during even the most stuffy moments. One of their mightiest early ties was their mutual affection for pranks. Childhood pictures displayed them murmuring jests at Trooping the Colour, shoving each other into the liquid during family trips, and vying fiercely during sports days at Ludgrove and Eton. They rode horses together at Highgrove, played digital games late into the night, and utilized the same hidden paths around palace halls. Wherever one went, the other was not distant. Then arrived the instant that defined their fraternity for the globe. Walking behind their mother's casket in 1997, they were merely 15 and 12. That sluggish march up the Mall was not only a public deed of sorrow, it was the junction at which they silently rested on each other, literally stride for stride. People who viewed them later stated that in the days that ensued, they spent hours together, chatting, sitting quietly, or simply being flank to flank because nobody else could fully grasp what they had lost. As youths, their bond grew in distinct manners. They shared a zeal for athletics, football, skiing excursions with their mother, and subsequently polo games. As grown-ups, Harry would frequently yell loudly from the edges when William played at school, and William pushed Harry through the highs and lows of his schooling. Their army careers later reflected that same nearness. They both drilled at Sandhurst, took part in shared tasks, and wore their garbs with a sense of glory that linked them back to their mother's faith in service. Even as maturity brought distinct roles and duties, their early nearness remained a defining piece of their self. They stood shoulder to shoulder at public functions, combined forces for philanthropic plans, and frequently spoke about how each had molded the other's life. Birthdays, family vacations, and shared customs kept them bound together even as the globe watched their roots separate. That is why any peace now bears such emotional burden. It is not merely about soothing strains or ironing over disputes. It is about refining the tie formed long before royal names or global study. The bond of two lads who grew up navigating sorrow, duty, and immense strain together. It is about reclaiming the recollections that molded them, the humor, the pranks, the backing, and the moments when one brother steadied the other without needing to talk. For William and Harry, peace is intimate. It is a return to the bedrock of who they were and who deep down they still are. If Charles really had a part in the choices that drove Harry and William asunder, it posits a tough query. Did the Queen know any of this was transpiring, and if she did, why would she not intervene to protect her grandsons from the consequences? Please contribute your opinions to us in the comment area. Recall to like, share, and subscribe for additional content. Also select the upcoming video appearing on your display, you will appreciate it.